Picture this: a crowded airport terminal, a veteran waiting quietly with his service dog, and a woman in red who makes one careless choice that changes everything. In seconds, a simple act of arrogance spirals into chaos. Alarms blare, federal agents rush in, and the entire terminal is forced into lockdown. But beneath the flashing lights and viral cameras lies a story bigger than outrage, a test of dignity, loyalty, and the quiet strength of a man who refuses to raise his voice, even when the world demands it. The airport was alive in the way only airports could be. A strange in-between world where time seemed both hurried and suspended. The glass ceiling let in thin morning light, filtered through streaks of cloud that painted the concourse in patches. Every corner hummed with movement. Announcements echoed from overhead speakers, their voices calm but mechanical, announcing flight numbers and boarding gates in the same practiced tone that had comforted and irritated travelers for decades. Rolling suitcases clattered across the tiled floor, their wheels clicking rhythmically like distant metronomes. Children clung to stuffed animals while being dragged forward by parents who tried to balance boarding passes and coffee cups in the same hand. Business travelers tapped impatiently on their phones, glancing at wristwatches as though time itself were plotting against them. Couples sat in chairs near windows, whispering in half-asleep tones, their luggage forming small barricades around them, and through it all was the scent, layers of it, mixing and overlapping until it created a unique perfume of the terminal. Bitter roasted coffee from a kiosk in the corner, cinnamon rolls sweet enough to make the air heavy, faint traces of perfume and aftershave from passengers brushing past one another. There was also the less pleasant side, the faint temps of cleaning chemicals, the musk of too many bodies packed into a space designed more for function than comfort, and the metallic taste of recycled air that seemed to cling to the throat. Security lines snaked endlessly across roped-off lanes, passengers shifting from foot to foot, sighing as they inched forward. Every few minutes, the conveyor belts hummed as trays of laptops, shoes, and half-empty water bottles slid into the scanning machines. Uniformed TSA officers repeated the same instructions in steady, measured tones. Laptops out of bags, liquids in clear containers, belts off. It was a script they had spoken so often, it came out like breathing. There was no urgency here, not yet. Just the low thrum of 1,000 private journeys brushing against one another in an accidental, temporary community. A woman in a business suit rehearsed a presentation under her breath, her eyes darting over index cards as though the words would evaporate if she didn't keep reading. A family of 5 struggled with passports, the youngest tugging on her father's sleeve, asking why they couldn't just get on the plane already. An older couple, moving slowly with the measured steps of age, sat side by side on a bench, their hands linked loosely, their gazes turned toward the runway where planes lifted into the sky one after another. The airport had its own rhythm, its own music. Laughter from a group of college students on their way to spring break blended with the weary sighs of a man in a wrinkled suit who clearly had no interest in small talk. The rolling announcement board ticked softly as letters flipped, updating gates and statuses. A janitor pushed his cart past rows of occupied seats, his broom clicking lightly against the tile. Every sound layered atop the next until the terminal itself seemed to breathe, inhale and exhale, alive with motion. No one noticed the undercurrent just yet, the fragile balance between order and chaos that always existed in places like this. Airports held secrets in plain sight, the unspoken anxieties of travel, the hidden stories in every suitcase, the quiet desperation of those running to catch flights that meant more than just connections. But in this moment, it was all routine, all noise, all background, the kind of scene you'd pass through 100 times without a second thought. At the far end of the concourse, a child laughed too loudly at a joke only he understood. A gate agent called for final boarding, her voice cutting through the noise with the sharpness of authority. Somewhere overhead, the muted thunder of a jet taking off rattled the glass panes, a reminder of the constant departures and arrivals, threading the day together. And yet, despite the ordinariness, there was a tension woven into the air so faint that no one could name it, yet heavy enough to prickle at the edge of awareness. 100 tiny stories collided in this space, none more important than the others. At least not yet. For now, the terminal was just itself, alive, restless, and unaware that before the hour ended, everything about its rhythm would change. The chatter, the rolling wheels, the smell of coffee and cinnamon and jet fuel would all be pierced by a moment, so sharp it would cut through the ordinary and leave. The memory of this morning burned into everyone who had been there, but in this first breath of the day, The airport pulsed with normalcy. People hurried. People waited. People lived their small stories against the vast machinery of travel. And somewhere among them, unnoticed, the first thread of something far larger was already beginning to weave itself quietly into the fabric of the morning. The automatic doors at the entrance side opened, and with them came a rush of cool morning air that briefly disturbed the airport's heavy atmosphere. People streamed through in waves, families tugging strollers, business travelers balancing briefcases and phones, young couples laughing as they dragged oversized duffels behind them. But among the crowd, one figure moved with a quiet steadiness that set him apart, though few noticed. His name was Jack Turner. Jack wasn't old. Not in the way people often imagined veterans to be, hunched with age and stooped with time. He was in his late 40s, shoulders squared, his gait measured and deliberate. The kind of walk that spoke of discipline, even when the man himself made no effort to project it. His eyes, a muted gray, scanned the terminal not with impatience, but with calculation, as though he was unconsciously assessing exits, bottlenecks, and escape routes. Years of training didn't fade just because the uniform came off. Beside him padded a German shepherd with a dark, sleek coat, and a calm intelligence in its gaze. Ranger moved in perfect rhythm with his handler, every step a mirror of Jack's own. A vest fitted snugly across his body marked him clearly. Service DOG, do not distract. Most people respected it, glancing briefly before returning to their own lives. A few children stared with open curiosity, until parents tugged them away, whispering that the dog was working. For Jack, Ranger wasn't just a companion. He was anchor, tether, lifeline. There were days quiet, unseen days when the memories pressed in too close, when the noise of the world grew jagged and unbearable. Ranger steadied him then, pressed close, guided him back to the present, with a nudge of his nose or the firm weight of his body leaning into Jack's leg. At the airport, with its chaos of crowds and blaring announcements, Ranger's presence was not a comfort but a necessity. Jack adjusted the strap of his duffel bag, the canvas worn at the edges, a bag that had traveled more places than most people ever would. He wasn't here for leisure, nor for business. His ticket was tucked neatly in his breast pocket, folded once, the way soldiers fold important things when they need to keep them close. To anyone watching, he looked like any other man catching a flight. Only those who knew the language of scars would have recognized the story written in the set of his jaw and the shadows beneath his eyes. The terminal absorbed him seamlessly, just another passenger moving through its veins. And that was how Jack liked it. He never craved attention. He didn't need strangers to thank him for his service. Didn't care for the awkward handshakes or the rehearsed phrases of gratitude that often came without understanding. What he wanted, what he had always wanted, was quiet. A seat at the gate. A smooth boarding. A chance to travel from one point to another without incident. But airports have a way of testing even the most patient souls. The line at security stretched. Long passengers fidgeting with boarding passes, sighing audibly when the queue inched forward by only a few feet. Jack waited without complaint, one hand resting lightly on Ranger's harness. His eyes were still, but his ears caught everything. The cough behind him, the impatient tapping of a woman's high heels to his left, the click of a ballpoint pen being used by a harried man filling out paperwork in line ahead, each sound slotted into place. Part of the controlled chaos he endured without flinching. Some people noticed him, if only briefly. A middle-aged man in a baseball cap glanced at Ranger and offered Jack a tight nod, a silent acknowledgement that needed no words. A TSA officer, young and nervous, straightened his stance when Jack's eyes met his, though Jack gave no sign of intimidation. To most, though, he was invisible. Just another traveler with a dog, lost in the sea of anonymous faces. Ranger, however, was not invisible. His alertness drew attention without meaning to. He sat neatly whenever Jack stopped, ears pricked, gaze sharp, but his body never restless. He radiated a quiet authority that contrasted with the frenzied energy of the terminal. The kind of authority that made people step a little wider when passing, not out of fear, but out of respect. Jack exhaled slowly, steadying himself the way he had learned to do 100 times in 100 different places. Airports were not battlefields, but they had the same energy and certainty. Bottlenecks, crowds pressing against one another, the possibility of sudden chaos. He kept his breathing even, his shoulders square, his hand on Ranger's harness. He reminded himself, as he always did, that this was a journey like any other. One flight, one destination, one day closer to the quiet. He still sought. No one in the terminal knew his name. No one guessed what he had carried, or how many times his hands had pressed down on wounds that wouldn't stop bleeding, or how many faces he still saw in his sleep. To them, he was just another man waiting for his turn in line. But Jack Turner's arrival was no ordinary addition to the day's routine. His presence, and Ranger's, would soon become the center of a story that would turn the pulse of the airport from ordinary noise into something unforgettable. For now, though he simply stepped forward when the line moved, Ranger at his side, both of them quiet as stone. The storm had not yet touched them, but it was coming. Ranger was more than a dog, though most who passed him only saw the sleek coat and the vest that marked him as working. He was large for his breed, broad-shouldered, with a coat that gleamed like polished mahogany under the terminal lights. His eyes were steady and dark, watching everything with a focus that seemed almost human. He was a creature of discipline, a product of training measured in thousands of hours, but more than that, he was the steady pulse beneath the quiet life of Jack Turner. In the noisy chaos of the airport, Ranger moved like water flowing around rocks. Jack barely needed to guide him. A soft word, a flick of the hand, and Ranger adjusted course, weaving through suitcases, strollers, and crowds with a calmness that belied the storm of movement around them. Where other dogs might have been restless or distracted, Ranger seemed untouched by the commotion, his attention tethered solely to his handler. A few children pointed, their eyes bright with the delight only dogs could summon. One little boy, his hands sticky from a cinnamon roll, tugged his mother's sleeve and whispered, "Can I pet him?" The mother, weary from wrangling to other kids, glanced at the vest and shook her head quickly. "He's working," she explained. The boy frowned, but didn't protest. Something about Ranger's composure demanded respect, even from those too young to fully understand it. Jack had relied on Ranger for nearly 6 years. He still remembered the first day they were paired. The way the trainers had explained that processed service dogs weren't pets, they were extensions of their handlers, trained not just to obey commands, but to sense the unspoken. Ranger could detect shifts in Jack's breathing, the subtle stiffening of his shoulders, the way his fingers twitched when memories threatened to crowd to close. He knew when Jack needed grounding, when to press close, when to nudge his nose into Jack's palm to remind him he wasn't alone. Today, in the airport's terminal, Ranger's job was as vital as ever. Crowds were triggers, noise was pressure, and the endless shuffle of strangers could fray the edges of even the most disciplined mind. But Ranger stood like a pillar beside him, his steady presence reminding Jack that here, now, he was safe. Every time the line paused, Ranger sat neatly by Jack's leg. Every time the line moved, he rose instantly, never pulling, never straining, simply syncing his steps with his handlers. And yet, even as he worked, he was always alert to the world beyond Jack. Ranger's ears twitched at unusual sounds. His nose lifted briefly when a scent drifted across the crowd that didn't belong to sharp, too metallic, too out of place. His training had honed him into a guardian not just for Jack, but for the environment around them. Airports were complicated, places filled with countless stimuli, but Ranger filtered through them with precision, responding only to what mattered. Some passengers noticed, even if only subconsciously, a young woman juggling her coffee nearly spilled it as she passed, then caught sight of Ranger's calm posture. She paused, offered a small smile at Jack, and whispered, "Beautiful dog." Jack nodded once, acknowledging but not inviting further conversation. That was enough. Ranger wasn't meant to draw attention, but his very existence seemed to leave an imprint on those who passed, an aura of steadiness in a space where most people felt frayed. Jack sometimes thought Ranger was the best soldier he'd ever known. Loyal without question, vigilant without rest, steady without complaint. Ranger didn't speak, didn't argue, didn't carry the weight of doubt. He simply acted, and in that action, he became everything Jack needed him to be. The medals Jack had earned in the past meant less to him than the silent, constant service Ranger gave in the present. As they neared the front of the security line, the hum of the conveyor belt and the sharp clatter of trays grew louder. Jack's hand tightened slightly on the harness. Ranger sensed it instantly. Without being told, he pressed closer, his flank against Jack's leg, steadying him with the weight of his body. Jack exhaled slowly, the knot in his chest easing. That was Ranger's gift. He didn't just respond to commands. He anticipated needs. The terminal, with all its noise and movement, barely touched him. Ranger's world was Jack's heartbeat, Jack's breathing, Jack's silent signals. He had no idea that in just a few minutes, his training would be tested in a way that would change the entire airport. For now, He was only what he had always been: calm, unshakable, and ready. And as he sat at his handler's side, eyes sweeping the terminal with a watchfulness most humans could not comprehend, it was clear to anyone paying attention that this was no ordinary dog. Ranger wasn't here to be admired or entertained. He was here to work. And soon, that work would mean the difference between order and chaos. If Jack Turner and Ranger moved through the airport like stone and shadow, quiet, steady, almost invisible, the woman who appeared next was the opposite. She announced herself without a word, her presence slicing into the rhythm of the terminal as sharply as the click of her red heels. Against polished tile, Vanessa Cole was the kind of woman who lived in fast lanes and corner offices. Her crimson suit was tailored to perfection, the kind that whispered wealth and demanded attention. A leather briefcase swung from her shoulder, sleek and expensive, the kind that cost more than most people's rent. Her dark hair was drawn back into a severe twist, her makeup flawless, her lips painted to match her heels. She wasn't here to blend. Vanessa didn't blend anywhere. She arrived, and the air seemed to tilt to accommodate her impatience. She hated airports, hated the waiting, hated the lines, hated being surrounded by people who didn't move as quickly as she thought they should. She thrived in conference rooms, where she could dominate the floor, where silence meant weakness and speed meant strength. Here, in the slow crawl of security lines and endless boarding announcements, she felt trapped. Vanessa tugged her phone from her bag, her thumb flicking across the screen with a kind of speed that suggested she measured her worth in emails. Answered, and deal struck. Her jaw tightened as she skimmed a message from a colleague, who apparently hadn't understood the urgency of her request. She typed a reply with clipped precision, her acrylic nails tapping furiously, each keystroke a punctuation mark of her mounting frustration. When she looked up, her eyes narrowed at the sight ahead. A man, quiet, unremarkable, standing in the line with a German shepherd at his side. The animal sat neatly, blocking part of the lane with its broad body. Vanessa exhaled sharply, an impatient sound that earned her a glance from the man behind her. She ignored it, stepping closer, her heels striking louder. As if volume could bend the world to her will. The dog didn't move, neither did the man. They stood calm, steady, a silent obstacle in her path. "This is ridiculous," she muttered under her breath, though loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Animals don't belong in airports. People are bad enough." The woman in front of her, middle-aged, clutching 2 passports and a boarding pass, shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to hear. A child across the lane stared at Vanessa with wide eyes, sensing the edge in her voice. But Vanessa didn't notice, or if she did, she didn't care. Her world was urgency, and this man and his dog were one more delay in a morning already filled with them. She tapped her heel, faster now. She sighed theatrically. She rolled her eyes. Each gesture was a performance, designed for an audience she didn't realize wasn't watching. Or rather, they were watching, but not the way she thought. Where Vanessa saw herself as a woman, asserting dominance in an inconvenient world, others saw arrogance dripping from every movement. They saw entitlement stitched into the crimson thread of her suit. Vanessa's gaze flicked to her watch. If she missed this flight, the meeting in Chicago would unravel, and with it, the deal she had spent 6 months chasing. She pictured the smirk on her rival's face, the headlines she had dreamed of turning into her own victory, slipping into someone else's column. The thought fueled her irritation until it brimmed over into anger. She leaned forward slightly, directing her glare at the man with the dog. He didn't flinch, didn't even look back. His hand rested on the harness, steady, unshakable. The calmness in his silence infuriated her. People were supposed to react to her presence. He didn't. The dog didn't. They were walls when she expected doors. Her lips curled in disdain. "Unbelievable," she whispered, her voice carrying just enough to ripple through the line. Around her, passengers exchanged subtle glances. Some shook their heads, others lowered their eyes. No one challenged her outright, not yet. But the atmosphere had shifted. The woman in red had entered the story, and with her came attention sharp enough to cut through the ordinary pulse of the airport. She checked her phone again, her fingers trembling with restless energy. She didn't know it yet, but the morning would not belong to her schedule, her ambition, or her impatience. It would belong to the man she dismissed, the dog she despised, and the choice she was about to make. For now, though, Vanessa Cole simply tapped her heel against the floor, arms crossed, irritation blazing like a warning flare. The quiet airport hum had acquired a sharper edge, and the balance between order and chaos had just shifted. Even if no one yet realized how far, The security line crept forward, inch by inch, like a reluctant serpent. Each shuffle of feet brought passengers a fraction closer to the checkpoint where belts would be removed, pockets emptied, and bodies scanned. For most, it was a nuisance, an inconvenience to be endured. For Vanessa Cole, it was intolerable. Heels struck the tile with increasing force, each click an impatient metronome against the hum of the terminal. She shifted her weight from one leg to the other, arms crossed, eyes darting between the man in front of her and the service dog at his side. The dog sat motionless, regal almost, its gaze steady and unflinching. The vest across its back read, "Service dog, do not distract," but Vanessa read it only as obstacle. Jack Turner stood ahead, silent as ever, his hand resting lightly on the harness. He didn't fidget, didn't sigh, didn't betray a single ounce of irritation at the weight. His stillness made Vanessa grind her teeth. To her, silence was laziness, calm was weakness. In her world, those who stood still were left behind. Line edged forward. A toddler behind Vanessa began to cry, his small fists pounding against his stroller. His mother bent low, murmuring comfort. Vanessa glanced back sharply, the corner of her mouth curling in irritation. "Control your child," she muttered under her breath, though loud enough for the woman to hear. The mother's face flushed, but she said nothing. She pulled the stroller closer, rocking it gently until the boy's sobs quieted into hiccups. Ahead, Jack knelt briefly to check Ranger's harness. His movements precise, practiced. Ranger tilted his head, ears flicking as if in silent communication. Jack's lips moved, murmuring something meant only for the dog. Vanessa rolled her eyes. "Unbelievable," she whispered, this time drawing a glance from the man in the baseball cap a few spots back. He said nothing, but his frown lingered. It was always the small frictions that built into something larger. A sigh here, an eye rolled there, the sharp edge of entitlement cutting into the soft fabric of routine. Passengers began to notice her, not because she was striking in her red suit, though she was, but because of the tension she carried like perfume. It clung to her, sharp and sour, seeping into the line until people instinctively pulled away. She tapped her phone, scrolling furiously through emails, ignoring the signs above the checkpoint that asked passengers to prepare documents. She was too busy firing off clipped responses, too caught up in proving her importance, to see the way people were staring now, not with admiration, but with unease. Jack noticed. He always noticed. His eyes, calm and steady, swept the line without judgment, but with the quiet precision of a man who had been trained to read rooms. He saw the clenched jaw, the restless shifting of weight, the way Vanessa's energy unsettled the people around her. He said nothing. He never did. Silence was his language, patience his shield. Ranger noticed too. His ears flicked back, then forward again. His nose twitched as Vanessa stepped closer, her perfume sharp against the airport's recycled air. The dog didn't move, didn't growl, but his body stiffened in a way only Jack would recognize. A subtle warning, a sign of alertness. Jack gave the harness a light squeeze, grounding them both. The line inched again. Vanessa sighed loudly, this time, theatrically, her exasperation spilling into the space like spilled ink. The family ahead shuffled nervously, the child clutching his stuffed bear tighter. The woman with the passports glanced back at Vanessa, with a mixture of fear and annoyance, but quickly turned away. It wasn't a scene, not yet, just friction. Small, sharp edges scraping against the smooth routine of travel. Most people would forget it by the time they reached their gates. But some moments don't fade, they linger, they build, they set the stage for something greater. Vanessa adjusted her bag sharply, the corner brushing Ranger's flank. The dog didn't move, but Jack's eyes flicked down, checking, steadying. Vanessa muttered something under her breath, words lost in the din, but the disdain was clear in the curl of her lip. The terminal's pulse had changed. The rhythm was still there, the rolling suitcases, the chatter, the announcements overhead, but beneath it hummed a new tension. Small frictions, unnoticed by most, were carving the path toward something no one in line could yet imagine. As the line crept forward once more, the storm edged closer, quiet but inevitable. The security line moved again, a sluggish shuffle forward that did nothing to soothe Vanessa's frayed nerves. She had already checked her watch twice in the last 3 minutes, each glance igniting a fresh wave of impatience. Every second lost here was a second closer to missing her connection, a second closer to the deal slipping out of her grip. She lived in a world where time was currency, and she felt this line robbing her blind. Ahead, Ranger sat with the unshakable patience of a stone statue. His dark coat gleamed beneath the sterile airport lights, his eyes sharp and steady as he watched the world around him. Jack Turner rested one hand lightly on the dog's harness, his posture calm, his expression unreadable. The contrast between them, the steady veteran and his immovable dog, against Vanessa's restless energy, was so stark that even strangers in line could feel it. The boy in the stroller behind Vanessa whimpered again, his small voice cracking like a pebble against glass. His mother rocked him gently, humming something soft under her breath. Vanessa twisted around, her lips thinning. "For heaven's sake," she muttered, loud enough for the mother to hear. "Some of us have flights to catch." The woman's cheeks flushed, but she said nothing. She pressed her lips together, rocking the stroller harder until the boy's sobs melted into hiccups. A few other passengers exchanged glances, subtle frowns cutting across their faces. Vanessa ignored them. She was too focused on the man and dog still blocking what she saw as her rightful space in the line. When the family ahead hesitated, fumbling with their passports and boarding passes, Vanessa exhaled dramatically and shoved her briefcase forward, its edge brushing against Ranger's flank. The dog didn't move. He didn't flinch or snap. He simply shifted his weight slightly, pressing closer to Jack, his training holding him steady. Jack's hand tightened on the harness, grounding them both. That was when Maggie's voice drifted through Vanessa's mind, not because Maggie was there, but because of something someone ahead murmured. The kind of offhand comment that makes its way through a line. "Looks like that little girl's got her granddad's quiet eyes." It wasn't about Vanessa at all, but the words clung to her like burrs. She bristled. Quiet eyes. Quiet anything. She had built her entire life on being loud, visible, undeniable, and then it happened. Her foot shot out in one sharp, careless movement. The pointed toe of her red heel struck Ranger's side knot, hard enough to injure, but sharp enough to jolt. "Out of the way, mutt," she hissed. The sound that followed was not the bark of a dog or the yell of a man. It was silence, a deep, cutting silence that fell over the line like a dropped curtain. The family with the passports froze. The boy in the stroller stopped whimpering. Even the announcements from the speakers overhead seemed to fade into the background, distant and irrelevant. Jack's head turned slowly, his gray eyes settling on Vanessa with a weight that was heavier than anger. He didn't shout. He didn't lunge. He didn't need to. His silence carried the authority of a man who had seen worse than airports, worse than impatient women, worse than the casual cruelty of strangers. His hand dropped from the harness to Ranger's shoulder, steadying the dog, soothing the ripple of tension that stiffened the shepherd's frame. But Vanessa shifted under his gaze. She had expected protest, perhaps even a scene she could dismiss with sharp words and sharper gestures. But she hadn't expected a calm that was colder than fury, heavier than any lecture. For the first time that morning, her confidence wavered, just a flicker, but enough. The man in the baseball cap behind her muttered, "Did she just kick the dog?" Another voice answered, "Unbelievable." Phones began to appear, cameras tilting subtly as people lifted them, recording, documenting. The world had shifted, and Vanessa's sharp movement had cut the thread holding the morning together. Jack said nothing. His eyes remained steady, his hand firm on Ranger's shoulder. The silence stretched, unbearable, until it seemed to echo louder than any outburst. Around them, people held their breath, waiting for the next moment, sensing instinctively that the air had changed, that what had been a morning of lines and coffee and routine was about to unravel into something far greater. Ranger, ever the soldier, sat tall. His ears twitched, his gaze locked, his body tense, but obedient. The only movement came from the slow, deliberate nod Jack gave, not at Vanessa, not at the crowd, but to himself, as though acknowledging something inevitable. The snap had come, not from raised voices, not from chaos, but from one sharp kick, one careless word, one silence too heavy to ignore. And the airport, though it didn't know it yet, would not be the same again. The airport had gone so still that the ordinary sounds of travel seemed foreign, like echoes from another world. The conveyor belt hummed faintly in the distance, trays clattered onto rollers. A boarding announcement chimed overhead, but in the line where Jack Turner stood with Ranger, time itself seemed to hold its breath. Jack's hand remained on Ranger's shoulder, steady and calm, anchoring the dog as much as himself. Ranger had stiffened at the kick, a ripple of tension tightening through his muscles, but his training held. His ears flicked back, his chest rising in measured breaths, waiting for Jack's cue. For a dog like Ranger, commands were not just instructions. They were lifelines. The thread that tied instinct to discipline. Jack didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't let his body betray even a flicker of the anger twisting in the stomachs of everyone who had witnessed what had just happened. Instead, he stood like a stone planted in the river, letting the current rage around him, but never moving with it. His stillness wasn't weakness, which strength honed by years, in places where stillness meant survival. Vanessa Cole, in her crimson suit and clicking heels, shifted her weight, as though she had only brushed against the dog by accident. Her lips parted, ready to dismiss the moment with some sharp remark. But when her gaze met Jack's, the words withered. His grey eyes weren't fiery. They weren't stormy. They were steady, quiet, and impossibly deep. They saw through her, not in judgment, but in the way a man who had carried too much sees everything, as it is, stripped of excuses. The people in line felt the silence stretch. The mother with the stroller pulled her child closer, her arms wrapping around him like a shield. The man in the baseball cap lowered his phone. Not because he didn't want to film, but because he suddenly felt like filming was intruding on something larger, something sacred. Even the TSA officer at the front of the line straightened, his eyes darting nervously toward the commotion but hesitant to interrupt. Jack's voice, when it finally came, was low and deliberate. He's working. The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They carried the weight of everything behind them. Rangers. Years of training, the silent bond between soldier and dog. The countless days when that bond had been the thin line between order and collapse. The passengers nearest leaned forward, slightly, straining to catch his tone, but it wasn't for them. It was for Vanessa. She opened her mouth, a retort already curling on her tongue, but she stopped. For reasons she couldn't name, her throat tightened. His eyes didn't threaten, didn't accuse, they simply held her still, refusing to let her twist the narrative into her favor. Ranger pressed closer to Jack's leg, his body leaning into his handler. Jack's hand brushed lightly along the dog's neck, a silent signal of reassurance. To anyone else, it looked like a simple touch. To Ranger, it was a command. Stay calm. I've got this. The silence was louder than shouting could have been. People began to shift uneasily, whispering under their breath. A man near the back of the line muttered, "She kicked a service dog. That's a federal offense." Another added, "Who does that?" Each word spread like ripples across a pond, small at first but gathering force. Vanessa's face flushed, a sharp crimson that almost matched her suit. She straightened, pulling her phone from her bag as if retreating into its glow could shield her from the judgment closing in. But the weight of Jack's stillness pinned her. She could feel the collective gaze of strangers, some filming, some whispering, all condemning. And still Jack said nothing more. His stillness spoke for him. It said he had faced far worse than impatience and arrogance. It said his strength wasn't in words or gestures, but in the refusal to be moved by cruelty. It said that Ranger's worth wasn't up for debate. Not here, not ever. The veteran's silence turned the moment into something heavier than confrontation. It became a reckoning. Vanessa shifted again, her confidence fraying. The sharpness of her presence, the dominance of her red suit, all seemed to falter in the face of a man who chose calm over chaos, patience over fury. Around them, the terminal began to stir with new energy. Phones stayed lifted. Eyes stayed fixed. And for the first time that morning, Vanessa Cole wasn't the center of her own story. Jack Turner was. He didn't want it. He never had. But his stillness demanded it, and the airport, like a battlefield, like a congregation, recognized the authority of a man who carried his truth without needing to shout it. The snap had come in the kick. The stillness was the aftermath. And soon, the consequences would ripple outward until the entire terminal felt them. The hum of the airport was still there, announcements echoing from unseen speakers. The squeak of suitcase wheels against tile, the occasional burst of laughter from a group far across the concourse. But in the stretch of security line where Jack Turner stood with Ranger, the rhythm had changed. It was no longer the anonymous pulse of travel. It had shifted into something charged, something collective. Strangers were no longer strangers. They were witnesses. It began with the man in the baseball cap. He'd been quiet before, absorbed in the shuffle of the line. But now his phone hovered chest high, camera lens pointed at Vanessa and the dog she had kicked. His jaw was tight. His eyes narrowed. "I got that," he muttered, though whether to himself or to the woman beside him, no one could say. His voice carried, and a ripple passed through the queue, an awareness that the moment was being recorded, documented, immortalized. The mother with the stroller clutched her little boy tighter, her eyes flicking nervously between Vanessa and Jack. She hadn't spoken a word since the outburst, but her silence was no longer passive. It was protective, heavy with unspoken judgment. She rocked the stroller gently, humming again under her breath. But her gaze never left the scene unfolding a few steps ahead. A young man in a hoodie slipped his earbuds out, stuffing them into his pocket. He leaned forward slightly, curiosity bright in his eyes. He wasn't filming. Not yet, but his phone was in his hand, thumb hovering near the camera icon. To him, the airport had just transformed from routine to spectacle, and he wasn't about to miss his chance to see where it led. At the checkpoint ahead, two TSA officers exchanged glances. They had heard the silence more than they had seen the incident, the sudden vacuum of sound, the way the line had stiffened like a single body. One officer began to step forward, hesitating when he caught sight of Jack's stillness. Ranger's poised composure, and the woman in red, who looked both furious and fragile under the weight of so many eyes. Passengers outside the line began to notice too. A businessman sipping burnt coffee paused mid-step, his eyes drawn to the ripple of attention flowing backward through the queue. A flight attendant on her way to a gate slowed her pace, her polished shoes clicking softly as she scanned the frozen tableau. The veteran, the dog, the woman in red. The crowd gathering around them with phones raised like torches in the dark. Whispers filled the gaps in sound. She kicked the dog. It was a service dog. Can you believe that? The words moved faster than the line itself, spreading outward in concentric circles, until people who hadn't seen the act knew it had happened. Airports thrived on rumor, on overheard fragments of conversation, and this one had all the elements it needed to burn hot. Cruelty, arrogance, innocence embodied in the animal that hadn't fought back. Vanessa Cole felt it pressing in on her. From all sides, she had spent her life in rooms where her voice was the loudest, where she could command space with a gesture, a word, a glare. But here, her voice meant nothing. The crowd's silence was louder than anything she could summon. Phones hovered like eyes that never blinked. Even those not recording watched her with faces she couldn't manipulate. Jack didn't move. His stillness became the anchor around which the witnesses gathered. He didn't need to justify himself, didn't need to call attention to the wrong that had been done. The people around him had already taken up that burden. Their eyes, their phones, their whispers, all of it built into a collective judgment that required no speech from him. Ranger shifted only slightly, his flank pressed against Jack's leg, his gaze still sharp and steady. To the passengers nearby, the dog became more than an animal. He was a symbol, a working creature of loyalty and purpose, struck by cruelty but unbroken. The sight of him sitting tall after being kicked stirred something deep in them. Anger, protectiveness, respect. The terminal's energy thickened, the air itself seeming heavier. People at gates nearby began to crane their necks, drawn by the sight of a line that had stopped moving, frozen in place by something stronger than TSA procedure. Within minutes, what had been a moment between three figures, Jack, Ranger, Vanessa, had grown into a spectacle, witnessed by dozens, maybe more. Vanessa straightened, tugging her jacket as though fabric could shield her from their eyes. "This is absurd," she said finally, her voice sharp but trembling at the edges. "It was an accident. You're all overreacting." No one answered her. No one needed to. The silence of witnesses was its own verdict. Jack's voice came once more, low and calm. Just 3 words carried into the heavy air. "He's working. Respect." The crowd absorbed it, their silence deepening, their eyes sharper, their judgment unmistakable. And in that moment, the woman in red realized something she had never known before. That power wasn't always loud, wasn't always claimed. Sometimes, it was silent, shared among witnesses, anchored by a man and his dog who didn't need to prove anything at all. The terminal was no longer a place of transit. It was a courtroom, and the verdict was already forming. The first phone had already been lifted, but now, like dominoes tipping one after another, more screens began to glow. The line of passengers transformed into a gallery of witnesses, each camera raised with the quiet urgency of people who knew they were capturing something that mattered. The familiar blue-white glow of recording screens reflected against faces. Tired travelers, parents with children, business people in suits, all united in a moment that broke the monotony of travel and bound them together in silent judgment. Vanessa Cole felt the heat of their eyes before she noticed the phones. She turned slightly, catching the unmistakable shimmer of herself on half a dozen screens. Her image perfectly tailored, perfectly poised. The red of her suit burning under fluorescent lights was no longer hers to control. It belonged to the phones, to the internet waiting on the other side of record. 1,000 nameless Strangers could replay her impatience, her kick, her words, all without her permission. "This is insane," she hissed, clutching her briefcase tighter. "Stop filming me." I said it was an accident. No one lowered their phones. If anything, more came up. A teenager near the back of the line whispered to his friend, "It's going viral already. Look, someone's live streaming." His friend leaned closer, their eyes wide with a mix of awe and glee. To them, Vanessa was no longer a woman. They saw her as content. A moment to be shared, dissected, judged. Doc Jack Turner didn't flinch at the forest of phones surrounding them. His stillness deepened, his hand never leaving Ranger's shoulder. He had lived long enough to know the weight of eyes on him, but these were not the eyes of his brothers in combat, waiting on his command. These were the eyes of strangers, holding up rectangles of glass that captured fragments without context. He didn't fear them, he didn't need them, but he understood their power. Ranger, loyal and unshaken, shifted slightly, pressing closer to his handler. His gaze remained forward, steady, but his ears flicked at the rustle of jackets, the murmur of whispers, the faint clicks of cameras switching from stills to video. Even in this moment, he was working, grounding Jack, absorbing the tension so his handler could remain composed. The crowd's whispers grew bolder now, that phone stood between them and the woman in red. She kicked him. "It's a service dog, for God's sake. Doesn't she know that's illegal?" Each sentence carried a new weight, amplified by screens recording their delivery. Vanessa's voice rose, sharp and brittle. "You're all making a scene out of nothing." It wasn't. She cut herself off, realizing how her voice sounded in the air, sharp enough to slice, cold enough to bruise. Her words didn't soften the crowd. They hardened it. On the screens, her tone would be replayed again and again, stripped of explanation, stripped of nuance, distilled into arrogance. The TSA officer finally stepped forward, his expression uncertain. He raised a hand, attempting to calm the swell of voices. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask." But before he could finish, another voice rose from the line. She kicked a veteran's service dog. The man in the baseball cap said, loud enough for half the terminal to hear. His voice cut through the murmurs, like a gavel striking wood. Heads turned, the phones tilted toward him, catching his declaration as if it were testimony. Vanessa's mouth fell open. He didn't even say, but Jack did not need to. His silence was confirmation enough. His stillness spoke more loudly than her words ever could. The TSA officer froze, caught between authority and uncertainty, his radio crackling faintly at his hip. The weight of the crowd was shifting beyond procedure, beyond what rules dictated. It was no longer about boarding passes and bins of shoes. It was about judgment. Vanessa glanced around, her confidence cracking. Her eyes darted to the glowing screens, the lenses capturing her every movement. And for the first time that morning, she felt cornered. She could not outtalk the silence, could not outmaneuver the phones, could not outpace the slow inevitability of the internet, waiting to swallow her whole. And in that charged space, where silence was heavier than shouting, and screens were brighter than truth, the airport transformed again. It was no longer just a courtroom, it was an arena. And the crowd had chosen their story. Jack Turner remained still. Ranger sat tall. Vanessa Cole, surrounded by phones, stood suddenly small, in a red suit that no longer felt like armor, but like a target. The judgment had begun. The ripple of whispers had become a current by the time the first uniformed officer appeared. Not a TSA screener at this time, but a proper airport police officer, dark navy uniform, pressed sharp. A utility belt weighted with authority, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He walked quickly, his boots making a firmer sound than the shuffle of travelers. Heads turned. The crowd shifted. Phones pivoted to capture the new arrival. Hungry for escalation, Vanessa Cole straightened at the sight of him, relief flashing across her features. Finally, someone who would restore order. Someone who would see through the absurdity of all this. She adjusted her jacket, smoothed her hair, and stepped slightly forward, preparing to explain herself in her most commanding boardroom voice. She had argued down competitors, shut down auditors, and redirected entire contracts with the power of her tone. This officer would be no different. But the officer didn't look at her first. His eyes went to Jack Turner. Or, more specifically, to Ranger. The shepherd sat tall at Jack's side, vest gleaming with the words, "Service dog, do not distract." The officer's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He knew what that vest meant. He knew the law that protected it, and he knew the gravity of what had already happened. Even before a single word was spoken. "Sir," the officer said, his tone calm but respectful. Are you and your dog all right? The crowd caught the shift instantly. Phones tilted closer. Gasps rippled faintly through the line. Vanessa's mouth fell open. That wasn't the script she'd expected. The man was supposed to look at her first, defer to her urgency, listen to her complaint. Instead, he had gone straight to the quiet veteran she had tried to dismiss. Jack nodded once, his voice low and measured. We're fine. Ranger's ears flicked as though confirming the statement. The officer's eyes lingered on the dog, noting the subtle signs of tension still present in the animal's frame. The controlled discipline that only came from long, hard training. He gave another nod, this one slower, as though acknowledging, not just Jack's words, but the history written in his stillness. Then, finally, the officer turned to Vanessa. Ma'am, he said, his tone shifting not unkind, but firmer, clipped at the edges. Did you make physical contact with this service animal? The line hushed further. If that were possible. You could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights, the squeak of a faraway luggage cart. All eyes, all phones, all judgment converged on the woman in red. Vanessa's chin lifted. It was a misunderstanding, she said crisply. The dog was in the way. People need to move. That's not what I asked. The officer cut in, sharper now. Did you make physical contact with this service animal? The cameras caught everything, the flush creeping up her neck, the twitch in her jaw, the way her hands tightened on the strap of her briefcase. Her instinct screamed at her to deny it, to spin the narrative, to retake control. But even she knew, the phones had captured too much already. Any denial would be a lie exposed by pixels within minutes. Her voice faltered. Yes. But it wasn't. The officer raised a hand. Ma'am, that is a federal offense. Service animals are protected under the ADA. Interfering with, or harming them is grounds for removal from the premises and potential charges. The words fell like hammers. The crowd exhaled collectively, a sound of shock and vindication. The mother with the stroller hugged her child closer. The man in the baseball cap shook his head, muttering, "Told you." The teenager with the hoodie whispered, "Oh, this is definitely going viral." Vanessa's confidence cracked audibly in her voice. "This is absurd. I said it was an accident. I didn't hurt him." "You can't." But the officer was already lifting his radio, pressing the button on the shoulder mic. "Dispatch. This is Unit 37. I need a supervisor at Checkpoint C. Potential interference with a service animal." Copy. The radios crackled. More boots approached. Another officer appeared at the edge of the line. Then a supervisor in a white shirt, with silver insignia at the collar. The air thickened with the weight of authority, layered and undeniable. And still, through it all, Jack Turner remained still. Ranger sat poised at his side, quiet, calm, unshaken. The phones never left them, framing the veteran and his dog as the center of the story, an immovable foundation, around which chaos spun, and authority gathered. For Vanessa Cole, the woman in red, the script had been stolen. No amount of words could take it back. The law had arrived, and the terminal itself seemed to brace for what would come next. The moment the second officer arrived, the current of the airport shifted from tense to electric. Radios crackled, clipped voices broke across frequencies, and the collective hum of the terminal began to warp into something sharper, heavier. The word lockdown had not yet been spoken aloud, but the signs were there, postures tightening, eyes scanning, hands brushing radios and holsters. Airports are places that exist on the edge of order, one unexpected spark away from unraveling into chaos. Vanessa's spark had landed. The supervising officer, a man in his 50s with graying hair and steady eyes, stepped into the line. His presence silenced the murmurs instantly. He didn't need to raise his voice. The authority in his stride carried it for him. He looked first at Ranger, then at Jack, and finally at Vanessa. His gaze narrowing, as though piecing together the story without words. "Report," he said to the younger officer. She admitted to making contact with the service animal. "Sir," the officer replied crisply. "Crowd corroborates. Potential ADA violation." Phones angled upward, screens glowing. The word violation spread like wildfire through whispers. Vanessa's chest tightened. This was spiraling too far, too fast. She hadn't meant for it to escalate, hadn't expected the weight of law and judgment to fall on her shoulders so suddenly. She opened her mouth, but the supervisor's hand cut through the air, silencing her before she spoke. "Protocol first," he said. His radio hissed, and he pressed the button at his shoulder. "Control, this is Supervisor Harlan at Checkpoint C. We have a confirmed incident involving interference with a service animal." Crowd unstable. Initiate Tier 1 lockdown procedures for this concourse until further notice. The word lockdown landed like a thunderclap. The TSA agents at the front stiffened. One immediately moved to hold the conveyor belt. Trays still rattling forward floated. Another closed the rope lines, redirecting confused passengers backward. An automated voice boomed through the loudspeakers. Calm but absolute. Attention. All movement in Concourse C is temporarily suspended. Please remain in place until further instruction. Gasps erupted. The crowd shifted uneasily. Phones rose higher, recording the announcement. The sudden stillness spreading outward like ripples in water. People at nearby gates stood, peering over rows of chairs, drawn to the disturbance that had now overtaken an entire terminal. Vanessa's voice rose above the noise. Shrill and desperate. This is absurd. I didn't do anything that warrants a lockdown. This is harassment. But her words couldn't compete with the authority of the system. Red lights began flashing above security checkpoints, signals that procedures had shifted. Officers fanned outward, spreading their presence across the concourse, their hands guiding bystanders back, their faces masks of professional calm. Jack Turner hadn't moved. Not when the announcement came. Not when the lights flashed. Not when panic edged into the crowd. His hand stayed on Ranger's harness, grounding himself as much as the dog. Ranger sat tall, ears perked, but his body language was calm, steady, trained for chaos. The dog read the rising tension like weather, but he didn't falter. Jack's stillness flowed into him, and together they became the eye of the storm. The mother with the stroller pulled her son close, murmuring reassurance as she fumbled for her phone to text family. The man in the baseball cap whispered to no one in particular, "All this because she kicked the dog." His words were picked up, repeated, rippling through the crowd until the narrative solidified. Vanessa's face burned crimson. Her authority, her presence, her entire carefully constructed image was unraveling under the gaze of hundreds of strangers and the judgment of phones that never blinked. The word lockdown had sealed it, no matter what happened next. She was the woman in red, who had triggered an airport lockdown by kicking a veteran's service dog. Supervisor Harlan turned his attention to Jack. "Sir, we'll escort you and your service animal to a secure area. You're not under any restrictions. You've done nothing wrong, but we need to ensure your safety." Jack nodded once, silent as ever. He didn't need to protest. The system had already drawn the lines, already marked him as the one to be protected. Vanessa stepped forward, desperation tipping into panic. "What about me? I need to get to my gate. I have a flight." Harlan's gaze cut to her, sharp and cold. "Ma'am, you'll remain here until federal officers arrive. Interference with a service animal is not a trivial matter. And considering the instability of this crowd, you've made yourself the focus of an investigation." Her voice faltered, breaking into stammered syllables. This can't be happening. This is insane." But it was happening. The crowd knew it. The officers knew it. The terminal itself knew it. The lockdown was no longer just protocol, it was symbolic. It marked the moment when arrogance collided with quiet strength, when cruelty met consequence, when a red-suited woman's impatience rippled outward until it snared an entire concourse in its grasp. And through it all, Jack Turner remained still, Ranger at his side. The quiet center of a storm Vanessa Cole had never imagined she could unleash. The announcement repeated overhead, the sterile voice booming from hidden speakers. "Attention! All movement in Concourse C is temporarily suspended. Please remain in place until further instruction." The calmness of the words only made the panic worse. The airport was a hive, and someone had just struck the nest. At first it was confusion. Families pressed close together. Travelers craned their necks toward the security line, and conversations buzzed like static. What happened? Why are we locked down? Is it a bomb threat? Each question layered over the last, creating a hum of anxiety that grew louder with every passing second. Then came the fear. A man in a business suit tugged at the rope line, demanding to be let through. "I have a connection in 20 minutes. You can't do this." A young woman clutched her boarding pass in shaking fingers, her eyes darting toward the gate as though sheer willpower might open it again. A child began to cry, the sound sharp and piercing against the thickening silence. And that sound set others on edge. Phones were everywhere, now raised high, recording not just Vanessa and Jack, but the entire terminal. The flashing red lights above the checkpoint. The officers fanning out with rigid precision. The restless shifting of a crowd, no longer in control of its own movement. On screens, the story twisted in real time. Some called it a security scare, others a passenger altercation, others still a brewing scandal. By the time the truth spread, it would already have been rewritten 100 ways. Vanessa Cole stood frozen in the middle of it, her red suit blazing against the sterile backdrop. She had wanted to be noticed. Now she was seen more than she ever dreamed, and in the worst way possible. Around her, passengers pulled back instinctively, leaving her standing in a circle of empty space, as though she carried contagion. Her protests, once sharp, now sounded brittle against the roar of voices. This is madness. I didn't do anything wrong. Why are you all overreacting? But her words dissolved in the air, drowned by the rising hum of panic. The more she insisted, the less anyone listened. Jack Turner remained still, his hand anchored on Ranger's harness. To him, the chaos was familiar, almost eerily so. Crowds breaking into panic, voices rising in fear, the edge of hysteria creeping in. It was a pattern he had seen overseas. In villages and streets where one spark turned to fire, his training whispered through him. Stay calm, stay steady, let the storm burn itself down. Ranger mirrored him perfectly, sitting tall, unflinching even as the crowd swelled with nervous energy. But the crowd didn't see calm. They saw the dog, the symbol of order, struck by a woman who now shouted and flailed in her own defense. Fear sought villains, and they had chosen her. Is she the reason? Someone muttered. They said she kicked the service dog. Who does that? At an airport. The whispers fed the panic. Panic fed action. A group at the back began to push against the halted line, demanding answers. An elderly man stumbled as the pressure of bodies shoved forward, nearly toppling before an officer rushed to steady him. The officer's voice barked sharp commands. Stay back. Stay calm. But the words fell against a wave too loud to control. The mother with the stroller began to cry softly as she rocked her child, whispering reassurances she didn't believe. The boy's hiccuping sobs echoed faintly, threading into the cacophony, like a fragile cord. The teenager in the hoodie muttered, "This is going to be all over TikTok." His eyes wide, not with fear, but fascination. Supervisor Harlan's radio buzzed again. Concourse C lockdown confirmed. Crowd unstable. Additional units en route. His jaw tightened. He had seen situations like this unravel before, not from bombs or threats, but from the panic of people who didn't understand what was happening. Fear was contagious. And right now, the entire terminal was infected. Vanessa clutched her briefcase to her chest, as though it were armor. But armor doesn't help when the battlefield itself shifts. She was no longer in control of the story, no longer the one wielding power in the room. She was the symbol of what had gone wrong. The eye of the storm everyone wanted to blame. Jack's silence made it worse. The stillness of a man who had nothing to prove only highlighted the noise spilling from her lips. His quiet presence, flanked by Ranger's unwavering posture, became a point of stability for the crowd. Subtly, unconsciously, people began to gravitate toward him. They trusted the calm. They mistrusted the chaos. And so the terminal held its breath at the edge of panic. Fear buzzed in the air like static before a lightning strike. Phones captured every second, sealing the narrative in pixels. Lockdown had begun as protocol. Now it was theater played out in front of hundreds of eyes. Each passenger, an actor, an audience at once. The question was no longer why the lockdown had started. The question was what would happen when panic tipped fully into chaos. And that moment, everyone sensed, was coming fast. In the midst of the growing storm, Ranger did not move. The concourse quivered with panic voices overlapping. Children crying, the dull thump of feet shifting restlessly against tile. Phones hovered high, their lenses trembling with the unsteady hands that held them. Overhead, the loudspeaker repeated the sterile lockdown message for the third time, its words sounding less like reassurance and more like warning. Yet at the center of it all, Ranger sat still, his chest rising and falling in even rhythm, eyes steady, ears twitching but never breaking posture. His calmness was not accidental. It was the result of years of training, of endless repetitions under gunfire simulations, under shouting voices, under conditions meant to mimic chaos itself. Ranger had been bred for steadiness, drilled for composure, molded into a creature whose very breath was meant to anchor the man beside him. Where others saw only a German shepherd in a vest, Jack Turner knew better. Ranger was ballast. Ranger was the hinge between disorder and control. Jack's hand rested on the harness strap, the leather worn smooth by years of use. He didn't squeeze, didn't pull, just placed his palm there, warm and steady. The touch was enough. Ranger leaned slightly into him, acknowledging the bond. That bond had carried them both through darker storms than this. People began to notice. The mother with the stroller, tears streaking her cheeks, glanced toward the shepherd. She saw his posture, tall and unyielding, and her own trembling slowed. She whispered to her son, "See the doggy? He's brave. We'll be brave too." The boy sniffled, his small fists unclenching, soothed not by his mother's words but by the sight of Ranger's stillness. A businessman clutching his briefcase to his chest stared for a long moment before exhaling. "Look at him," he muttered to no one in particular. "Dog's calmer than all of us." The words rippled outward, caught by ears hungry for something steady. Even the officers, tense in their formations, began to steal glances. They knew what panic looked like. They knew how quickly crowds could spiral into stampedes. But here was a creature whose calm seemed to radiate outward, softening edges, steadying breaths. It wasn't magic. It was discipline. And in that discipline, the crowd found a model. Vanessa Cole, however, didn't see calm. She saw defiance. To her, Ranger's posture was a challenge, a silent accusation that would not let her slip free. She tried again, her voice shrill. "Why is everyone looking at him? He's just a dog. This is ridiculous." The words struck like stones thrown into a pond, but the ripples didn't spread this time. Instead, they fell flat, silenced by the quiet strength sitting on four legs. Phones caught her outburst, of course, but it was her tone against Ranger's stillness, and the stillness won. Jack's silence reinforced it. He had spoken only a handful of words since the incident, yet his restraint gave them weight. In the stillness of Ranger, the crowd saw Jack. In Jack, they saw the embodiment of a truth they could feel but not name. Real strength doesn't shout, it stands. A child a few rows back tugged his father's sleeve and whispered, "Daddy, the dog's not scared." The father nodded, swallowing hard, as though ashamed that his own legs had been trembling when Ranger hadn't flinched. Supervisor Harlan noticed too. He leaned toward his younger officer and murmured, "That dog's keeping this crowd together better than any of us." The officer nodded, eyes never leaving Ranger. The panic didn't vanish. It still simmered, buzzing in the air, but its edge dulled. People breathed slower. The shuffle of restless feet quieted. Phones still recorded, but their lenses weren't shaking as much. Ranger had become the axis around which the chaos revolved. Jack whispered, low enough for only Ranger to hear, "Good boy, hold steady." The dog's ears flicked back in acknowledgement. He didn't need more than that. And so, in a terminal where fear had clawed its way into every corner, calm came not from announcements or officers or authority, but from the quiet dignity of a working dog who had seen worse storms and learned how to sit tall through them. The crowd didn't realize it yet, but the tide had begun to turn. Panic had peaked, and now, slowly, the presence of the dog who would not break, was pulling them back from the edge. Vanessa Cole could scream. She could protest. She could rail against what she saw as unfair. But none of it mattered anymore. The terminal had chosen its symbol, and it wasn't her. It was Ranger. The concourse had quieted under Ranger's steady presence. But quiet does not mean peace. It was the silence of tension pulled taut, the stillness before a storm breaks again. Phones still hovered in the air like sentinels, their recording lights glowing faintly. The crowd's breathing was calmer, but their eyes sharp, expectant. Restless remained fixed on Vanessa Cole in her red suit, and she could feel it, pressing on her from every side, suffocating in its weight. She snapped. "This is ridiculous," she shouted, her voice carrying over the heads of travelers and into the domed ceiling above. "You're all acting like I committed a crime. I nudged a dog, and now what? The entire terminal shuts down. Lockdown. Police. Cameras. Do you people hear yourselves?" Her words hung in the charged air, brittle and desperate. For a beat, the crowd only stared. Then the murmurs returned. Harsher now. "She kicked him. Not nudged, kicked. Service dog. Federal law. She doesn't get it." Each fragment carried like embers in the wind, igniting judgment in corners she couldn't reach. Vanessa turned in a circle, scanning the faces, searching for a sympathetic expression. But sympathy had fled. The woman in red stood alone in a widening ring of empty space, every inch of her defiance reflected in dozens of glowing screens. Supervisor Harlan stepped forward, his voice firm. "Ma'am, lower your voice. You're only making this worse." "I have every right to speak," she snapped, jabbing a finger toward Jack. "He's milking this. Look at him. Standing there, silent, letting everyone pile on me. Why doesn't he say something? Why doesn't he stop this madness? All eyes shifted to Jack Turner. He didn't move, he didn't speak. His hand rested on Ranger's harness, his gaze steady, his posture unbroken. The silence was its own response, louder than any defense or accusation could have been. The crowd read it not as weakness, but as strength, the kind of strength that didn't need to shout. Phones caught the image, zooming in, the veteran, and his calm dog, unmoved by the storm raging around them. Vanessa's laugh cracked, high and sharp. See, he won't even deny it. He wants this attention. He's enjoying it. But the crowd didn't laugh with her. They recoiled, some shaking their heads, others muttering openly now. She's losing it. Blaming him. After what she did, unbelievable. The younger officer took a step closer, his stance tightening, his hand near his belt. Ma'am, I'm warning you. Calm yourself now. Vanessa's hands trembled as she clutched her briefcase. But pride pushed past fear. No. You don't get to paint me as the villain here. I have rights, too. I have a flight to catch, a meeting to attend. I will not be humiliated by this. She gestured wildly toward Ranger. The reaction was instant. Gasps, shouts. The mother with the stroller spoke up, her voice clear and trembling with indignation. That dog is worth 10 of you. The words struck hard, and the crowd murmured approval, the tide surging further against Vanessa. Her face flushed crimson. She opened her mouth to retort, but Supervisor Harlan raised his hand sharply. That's enough. You're done talking. His voice carried with the weight of authority, honed over decades. Vanessa froze, chest heaving. For the first time, doubt cracked her defiance. Then the radio at Harlan's shoulder crackled. The dispatcher's voice sharp. Supervisor Harlan, Federal agents en route. ETA, 2 minutes. Maintain lockdown. Hold subject in place. 2 minutes. The crowd stiffened with anticipation, whispers darting like sparks through dry grass. Phones rose higher. Whatever came next, they would capture it. Vanessa's eyes darted wildly. She was cornered, every exit sealed by law, by judgment, by the cold lens of public scrutiny. Her arrogance sputtered into desperation. This isn't fair, she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. This isn't who I am. But no one answered. The confrontation had escalated past the point of words. The stage was set. The crowd waited for the final act, and at the center of it all, Jack Turner remained still, Ranger calm at his side, silent witnesses to the collapse of the woman in red. The hum of the crowd quieted when they appeared. 2 figures in dark suits, moved with the efficiency of men who did not need to announce themselves. Their jackets cut clean lines, their strides purposeful, their earpieces glinting faintly under the fluorescent lights. Federal agents. The words rippled through the terminal in whispers, and suddenly the murmurs dropped to a hush, as though the air itself understood authority had arrived. Supervisor Harlan stepped forward to meet them. His jaw set, shoulders squared. The younger officers shifted subtly, their relief almost visible. Lockdowns are heavy burdens to carry. Federal presence meant the weight was no longer theirs alone. The taller of the 2 agents scanned the scene, his eyes sharp, assessing, lingering on each key figure. The trembling mother with the stroller. The recording teenagers, the weary officers, Jack Turner with his steady posture, and finally Vanessa Cole, flushed and rigid in her red suit. His gaze lingered on her, narrowing as though he could already read the story written in the tense lines of her body. Report, the agent said, his tone clipped, leaving no space for embellishment. Harlan nodded once. Civilian interference with a service animal. Multiple witnesses. Admission of contact. Crowd destabilized. Lockdown initiated for safety. The agent's eyes flicked to Ranger. The dog. Jack Turner spoke for the first time in minutes, his voice low but clear. He's fine. It wasn't much, but it carried. The crowd leaned in slightly, phones tilting to capture the veteran's words. That calm, simple assurance worked like a stone dropped into water, sending ripples outward. Ranger, as though understanding his name had been spoken, sat a little taller, his steady gaze sweeping the crowd. The shorter agent stepped toward Vanessa. Ma'am, please place your bag on the ground. Vanessa clutched her briefcase tighter, her eyes darting between the agents and the circle of onlookers. This is absurd. I haven't committed a crime. I'm being humiliated for no reason. The agent's voice didn't rise, but the edge in it could cut steel. Ma'am, you admitted to interfering with a service animal. That is a crime. Your behavior has already triggered federal security protocols. Now put the bag down. Her lip trembled. For the first time, real fear cracked through the arrogance. She lowered the briefcase slowly, setting it beside her heels. Phones zoomed in, capturing the act, not as obedience, but as surrender. The taller agent addressed the crowd, his voice steady, commanding, "Ladies and gentlemen, remain calm. There is no danger to your safety. Please remain where you are until the lockdown is lifted." The reassurance landed. Shoulders unclenched. Parents hushed their children with softer voices. Even the restless teenagers quieted, though their phones remained high, recording every syllable. The agents turned back to Vanessa. One reached for her elbow, guiding her gently, but firmly away from the open space. "You'll accompany us for questioning. You are not under arrest at this moment, but you will comply. Failure to comply will change that immediately." Vanessa's eyes darted toward the crowd, searching desperately for sympathy, for a lifeline. But the only eyes meeting hers were cold, unyielding, and framed by the glow of recording screens. She was no longer a woman trying to make her flight. She was a headline being written in real time. Jack Turner watched without moving. He felt Ranger press slightly against his leg, steady as ever, and he allowed himself a slow breath. This was not combat, not the jungle, not a firefight, but it was a battlefield, all the same. And the enemy had been disarmed, not by weapons, but by truth laid bare in front of witnesses. As the agents led Vanessa toward the edge of the terminal, the crowd parted instinctively, leaving a wide berth. Some turned their phones to follow her exit, but many turned back toward Jack. In his stillness, in Ranger's calm, they found the story that mattered. The lockdown wasn't over, not yet, but the tide had shifted. Authority had stepped in, and justice, quiet and heavy, was now in motion. And in that charged silence, the crowd realized something they would carry long after their flights resumed. It wasn't the woman in red who defined the story of this day. It was the quiet veteran, his loyal dog. And the lesson that strength does not shout, it endures. The agents had moved Vanessa toward the far side of the concourse, their dark suits cutting like blades through the crowd. The terminal, however, did not simply reset. Lockdowns leave residue and aftertaste of fear and curiosity, and the people left standing in concourse were buzzing with it. At first, the hum of whispers grew louder, like bees shaking off smoke. Travelers shifted in clumps, their conversations overlapping. Some rehashed what they'd seen. "She kicked the dog. I saw it with my own eyes." Others argued over the details. "No, she shoved him. It was worse. She said she barely nudged him." "Doesn't matter. It was a service animal." Everyone became both witness and commentator, their voices weaving the narrative into something larger than what had happened in front of them. Phones hadn't lowered. If anything, they were held higher, their lenses tracking not Vanessa now, but Jack Turner and Ranger. Dozens of feeds streamed live onto the internet, comment bubbles popping like fireworks on screens as strangers across the country joined in the judgment. "Hero dog. Respect the veteran. That woman's career is over." The world beyond the terminal had already begun to shape the myth. The mother with the stroller was the first to step forward. She pushed the buggy gently, her voice soft but clear, as she stopped near Jack. "Sir," she said, her eyes flicking from him to Ranger. "Thank you for your service, for your patience, for not losing your temper. I don't think I could have stayed that calm." Her words quavered, but they carried, and several heads nodded in agreement. Jack inclined his head politely, his lips parting only enough to say, "Ma'am," in quiet acknowledgement. He didn't need more. His silence itself was eloquence. The businessman with the briefcase chimed in next, his voice louder, carrying across the rows of halted passengers. "I've been traveling 30 years, and I've never seen anyone handle something like that without blowing up. You set an example, sir, more than any of us could have done." The ripple spread. A teenager in a hoodie lowered his phone just long enough to say, "Your dog's a legend, man," before lifting it again, capturing Ranger sitting stoic and unflinching despite the clamor. Others added murmurs of agreement, phrases overlapping. "True discipline, real strength. That's what family looks like." Ranger shifted slightly, his eyes sweeping the crowd as though measuring them, reading their energy. A child crouched low a few feet away, whispering to his mother, "Can I pet him?" The woman shook her head quickly, whispering back, "No, honey. He's working. He's a hero." The title stuck. Hero. The word spread like a current, soft at first, then louder, muttered from lips to lips, until it became the undertone of the crowd. Not Vanessa, not the woman in red, not the outburst that had triggered the lockdown, The story had pivoted. The veteran and his dog had become the axis around which everything else spun. Supervisor Harlan noticed too. He stood a little straighter, watching the way the crowd's mood shifted. No longer a mob on the edge of panic, but a congregation orbiting calm. He leaned toward the younger officer. He's got them in hand better than any of us. We just need to keep it steady until control lifts this lockdown. The younger officer nodded, his eyes fixed on Ranger. That dog's doing half our job for us. Vanessa, held firmly at the periphery by the agents, could hear some of it. Each whisper, each murmur of praise for Jack, each acknowledgement of Ranger's discipline, twisted like a knife. She had come into this terminal expecting deference. Instead, she had become the villain in a story that would outlive the flight she was so desperate to catch. Jack felt Ranger lean ever so slightly against his leg, grounding him. He allowed himself one long, slow exhale. He didn't need the crowd's praise. He didn't crave recognition. But in that moment, he understood its power not for him, but for the lesson it carried. People were watching. People were learning. Sometimes the best way to teach wasn't to raise your voice, but to refuse to let anger take you. The concourse settled into something new. Not panic, not chaos, but reflection. 1,000 private thoughts stirred behind those watchful eyes, each one re-evaluating what they had just witnessed. And so the crowd reacted not with riot, not with rage, but with respect. A ripple of quiet reverence that even the loudspeakers and flashing red lights could not drown out. The lockdown still held, but the storm had shifted. The first articles appeared online before Vanessa had even been escorted fully out of sight. That was the power of the airport, the endless flow of Wi-Fi, the swarm of smartphones, the compulsion of travelers to turn every moment into content. What had begun as shaky footage of a red-suited woman lashing out at a dog was now a viral thread, stitched together by dozens of perspectives, each clip overlapping, each caption sharpening the story. Woman kicks veteran service dog, triggers lockdown hero dog keeps crowd calm amid chaos. Who is the quiet veteran at Concourse C? The headlines raced through Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, and news apps. By the time federal agents had Vanessa secured in a side office, millions of strangers were already replaying the moment in slow motion, circling the blur of her leg, zooming in on Rangers.com, analyzing Jack's stillness. The world outside the airport terminal was waking up to a drama that seemed made for outrage. Inside the concourse, passengers became reporters. Some narrated live streams into their phones, their voices pitched with the thrill of having witnessed history in miniature. I was right there. Gate C12. She totally kicked the dog. The vet didn't even flinch, stood like a rock. Dog didn't move. Whole place went into lockdown. Unreal. Others posted selfies with the red lights flashing behind them. Captions, screaming, I was there when the airport shut down over a dog. A woman in her 20s, perched on the edge of a carry-on suitcase, tapped furiously on her laptop. She was a freelance journalist, always sniffing for a story, and this one had landed in her lap without warning. Viral within the hour, she muttered, already stringing together a narrative laced with words like heroism, arrogance, justice. Her article would be published before most people even boarded their flights. Jack noticed none of this. He stood where he had stood since it began, one hand on Ranger's harness, his posture unbroken. He had lived enough to know what happened. When cameras pointed at you too long, the world would build its own story, whether or not you told it. Better, he thought, to remain silent than to feed a fire already roaring. But the fire grew anyway. Television screens mounted above the gates flickered suddenly from flight schedules to breaking news banners. Local affiliates had grabbed the story from social feeds, dressing it up with bold graphics. Live from Militant International. Service dog incident prompts lockdown. Passengers gasped when they realized their terminal was now on every screen in the airport. Some cheered quietly. Others hid their faces. More than a few turned their cameras back toward the televisions, looping the story inside itself. Supervisor Harlan frowned, muttering to the younger officer, Great. Now we've got a circus. The younger officer sighed. At least the focus isn't on a bomb scare. This they can handle. Outrage is easier than fear. And outrage had indeed found its vessel. Vanessa's name wasn't known yet, but her image was. The woman in red, her face contorted with frustration, her voice shrill in denial. Those images were already burned into the feeds of strangers across the country. She had wanted to be respected, perhaps even admired, and now she was infamous. The crowd inside the terminal shifted as the story reached their phones in real time. Passengers who had only seen fragments now had captions telling them what to believe. Some angled their screens toward neighbors. "Look, it's trending already." Others whispered, "She's finished. Her career's over." The narrative had solidified, and with it, Judgment. Ranger lay down at Jack's feet, finally easing into a rest, though his eyes remained alert. The shift in posture drew a collective murmur. People saw it not as weariness, but as victory. The hero dog, having faced chaos, now rested, and the symbolism was not lost on anyone. For Vanessa, in the small office down the hall, the story was being written without her. She would speak later, perhaps in protest, perhaps in apology, but the truth was already gone. The media had ignited, and in their flames, her image had been consumed. In Concourse C, travelers sat a little straighter, aware they were part of something larger than a delay. They weren't just passengers anymore. They were eyewitnesses to a viral moment. Participants in a story that would spread far beyond the sterile walls of the airport. The frenzy had begun, and it was only growing hotter. The small office where Vanessa sat was nothing like the wide, echoing concourse she had left behind. Its walls were bland, painted in institutional beige, and the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. The air was cooler, drier, almost sterile, as though designed to strip away comfort and leave only truth. A metal table sat between her and the two federal agents. On it rested her briefcase, unopened, its once gleaming leather now looking like a weight she couldn't bear to touch. Vanessa folded her arms across her chest, her shoulders stiff. She tried to arrange her face into something calm, dignified, even defiant. But her hands betrayed her, tapping lightly against her elbow, restless, nervous. Across from her, the taller agent leaned forward, elbows on the table, his gaze steady. The shorter one stood by the door, arms crossed, silent but watchful. "Ms. Cole," the taller agent began, his voice clipped, "we need a clear account of what happened. Multiple witnesses state you struck a service animal in the terminal. Security footage confirms contact. Before we go further, do you want to adjust your statement?" She drew in a sharp breath. "I didn't strike the dog. That's an exaggeration. I nudged it, a gentle nudge. It was in my way." The agent didn't blink. "A service animal," her chin lifted higher. "Yes, but it's still a dog. People are overreacting. I was trying to catch a flight. I was under pressure, and you believe that excuses interfering with an animal trained to assist a veteran?" His tone didn't rise, but the weight in it pressed down like a hand on her chest. Vanessa flushed, her words tumbling out faster now, sharpened by desperation. "I didn't know. No one told me it was a service animal until afterward. It didn't even look like it was doing anything. Just sitting there, blocking the way. I was late. People were crowding, and I reacted. Everyone's acting like I attacked it viciously, when really the shorter agent finally spoke, his voice low and edged. "Ma'am, you kicked a federally protected animal in a federal facility. That is not a nudge. That is not a misunderstanding. That is a crime." Her breath caught. The word crime hung in the air, heavy and final. For a moment, panic flared in her eyes, but she smothered it quickly, replacing it with indignation. "This is insane. Do you know who I am? I'm a corporate attorney. I worked with senators, CEOs. This will ruin me if it gets out." "It's already out," the taller agent said flatly. He tapped the tablet in front of him, rotating it so she could see. The screen displayed a social feed. The top trending video, looping on silent, her leg jerking forward, Ranger's calm response. The gasp of the crowd. Her red suit glowing like a target under the fluorescent lights. Comment bubbles raced up. The side of the screen, thousands of them, merciless, mocking, outraged. Vanessa's mouth fell open. She reached for the screen, as if she could push the video away, erase it somehow, but her hand froze in midair. Her voice cracked when she finally spoke. "It's not fair. That clip makes it look worse than it was. They don't know me. They don't know the pressure I was under. They don't know, they know what they saw." The agent interrupted. His tone was calm, but unyielding. "And what they saw is enough." Vanessa's shoulders sagged for the first time, the weight of inevitability pressing her down. She shook her head, muttering to herself, "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I was just trying to get through the airport. I didn't mean to." Her words trailed off, unfinished, half apology and half excuse. The agents exchanged a glance they had seen it before. People cornered, not just by law, but by the unforgiving court of public opinion. Vanessa's defiance was cracking, but denial clung stubbornly to her, refusing to let go. "Ms. Cole," the taller agent said, finally, his voice firm but not unkind, You will have an opportunity to explain yourself, but you should know denial won't help you now. The world has already seen. What matters next is whether you choose to face it with honesty, or keep burying yourself deeper. Vanessa stared at her reflection in the dark screen of the tablet. For the first time, the mask of control she had worn so tightly began to slip. But instead of yielding, she drew herself up again, her voice sharper, colder. "I won't be your villain," she said, her words trembling but deliberate. "I won't let one moment define me." But the irony was clear, even to her. One moment had already defined her. And outside that small office, the world was not waiting for her version of the truth. While Vanessa Cole sat in the sterile office, locked in a battle with denial and consequence, Jack Turner remained in the concourse with Ranger at his side. The crowd had thinned somewhat, families ushering restless children toward quieter corners, businessmen returning reluctantly to their phones, teenagers still clinging to the idea that they were part of something viral. Yet the air was far from ordinary. The echoes of the confrontation still lingered like smoke after a fire. Jack lowered himself slowly into one of the molded plastic chairs near Gate C12. His knees ached with the familiar stiffness of old injuries, the kind that never truly healed, but were carried like permanent companions. Ranger settled at his boots, laying his head on his paws, amber eyes half-lidded, but never fully asleep. For a few moments, Jack simply breathed. In, out. The rhythm of a man trained long ago to ground himself no matter the storm. He thought of the woman in red, of her shrill denials, her wild gestures. He thought of the way the crowd had turned, not violently, but decisively, casting her out with their silence and their lenses. He had seen battles fought in mud and fire, but this had been something different, an arena of words, pride, and perception. And yet, in its own way, it was just as destructive. Jack rubbed a calloused thumb along Ranger's harness. "People see what they want to see," he murmured. The dog's ears flicked in acknowledgement, as though he understood. In his mind, Jack drifted back to years when his every decision had been measured in lives saved or lost. Vietnam had taught him that chaos doesn't arrive with warning, it explodes. Sudden and total, demanding clarity when clarity is hardest to find. Back then, he had relied on training, on instinct, on the weight of duty. Today, in an airport terminal, he had relied on silence. And it had worked. But silence wasn't without its cost. Jack leaned back, watching people still sneaking glances at him, their whispers just audible. "That's the vet. That's his dog." He didn't even yell. He wondered how many of them truly understood. To them, it was a moment of spectacle, a viral story they'd tell over coffee later. For him, it was another scar laid over old ones, a reminder that respect, like peace, was fragile and often won through endurance rather than force. He remembered Ranger's training days vividly, the long sessions in open fields, the tests of distraction, the endless drills of restraint. Ranger had been chosen not for ferocity but for steadiness, a dog who could face noise, fire, confusion, and still obey a quiet hand signal. That steadiness had saved lives once. Tonight, it had steadied a crowd. Jack felt a swell of pride, not in himself, but in the animal at his side, who had proven, yet again, that strength could be quiet. A child's voice pulled him from his thoughts. Mr. Jack looked up to see a boy of maybe 8, clutching his mother's hand but leaning forward bravely. "Your dog's really brave." Jack's mouth curved into the faintest smile. He nodded. "He is." The boy grinned, tugging his mother's arm. She smiled apologetically, whispering, "Thank you for everything." Then they moved on, leaving Jack in the stillness they had briefly disturbed. Moments like that reminded him why he endured, why he chose, after the war, not to vanish into bitterness, but to keep showing up in his town, for his family, and now, unexpectedly, for strangers in an airport. His life had been built on small, consistent choices. Tonight had been no different. Ranger shifted, pressing closer against his leg. Jack rested a hand on the shepherd's head, feeling the steady heartbeat beneath fur and muscle. "We did all right," he said softly, and as the lockdown lights still pulsed faintly overhead. Jack Turner reflected on the strange truth of his life, that sometimes the hardest battles were not fought with bullets or fists, but with silence, patience, and the refusal to move when the world demanded spectacle. The announcement came not with fanfare, but with the tired voice of the airport's public address system, crackling overhead like a storm finally breaking. "Attention passengers in concourse, see, the security lockdown has now been lifted. Please remain calm as operations return to normal. Thank you for your cooperation." The words washed across the terminal in waves of relief. A chorus of exhalations, followed sighs, muttered thanks, even a few nervous laughs. The crowd, which had been suspended in a strange tension for nearly an hour, shifted back into motion. Children fidgeted with new energy, rolling suitcases resumed their rattling songs, and the low hum of human travel began to reassert itself. The storm was over, but its mark remained. Supervisor Harlan, his shirt collar damp with sweat, pinched the bridge of his nose before stepping toward the veteran. "Mr. Turner," he said, his voice more formal now, "thank you. You and your dog, well, you did more for that crowd than any of us could have. I've been in this job 30 years, and I've never seen calm like that in the middle of chaos." Jack rose slowly, his joints protesting. Ranger followed, rising with practiced ease, shaking once before standing steady at Jack's side. Jack nodded at Harlan, his voice low. "Just did what we were trained to do. Nothing more." Harlan studied him a moment, then extended his hand. Jack hesitated. He had never cared for gestures that felt ceremonial, but he clasped it briefly. The officers gripped firm, grateful. "If it were up to me," Harlan said, "I'd have every passenger walk by and thank you before they board." Jack gave the faintest smile. "Let them get where they're going. That's thanks enough." Behind them, the federal agents re-emerged, their suits uncreased, their expressions unreadable. Vanessa Cole did not appear with them. Whispers rippled as passengers craned for a glimpse of the woman in red, but she was gone, escorted to some holding room, or perhaps already on her way to a more serious destination. Her absence was louder than her presence had ever been. The story she had ignited now burned without her, carried by phones, posts, and the judgment of strangers. The crowd, however, had one figure left to focus on. A young woman in a denim jacket approached cautiously, her phone tucked into her back pocket for once. "Sir," she said, her voice soft, "I know you probably don't want all this attention, but, thank you. My little brother's got autism. He has a service dog too. If someone had treated his dog the way that woman treated yours..." Her voice trailed off, but her meaning filled the silence. Jack inclined his head, his words simple. "Those dogs are family. They give more than most people ever will." Her eyes glistened as she nodded, then stepped back into the flow of passengers. Others followed, brief words, grateful looks, small gestures. No applause, no ovation, just a steady trickle of human acknowledgement. Each one a quiet thread weaving into something larger. Eventually, the crowd thinned. Flights resumed boarding, announcements echoed, and the terminal began to resemble its ordinary, chaotic self. But for those who had stood in Concourse C, ordinary would never mean quite the same thing again. They would remember the man who stood, calm while the storm raged, the dog who didn't flinch, and the lesson written silently in their stillness. Jack sat again, waiting for his boarding call. Ranger rested against his boots, eyes finally drifting shut. The veteran reached down, scratching gently behind the dog's ears. "We can relax now, boy," he murmured. "Job's done." And as the last red lockdown lights dimmed to green, releasing the concourse back to the ordinary hum of departures and arrivals, Jack Turner felt something rare, a sense that, even in the noise of an airport, silence had spoken the loudest. By the time Jack Turner's flight was called, the airport had slipped back into its familiar rhythm. The overhead speakers droned, boarding instructions, families clustered near gates, and coffee shops bustled with travelers chasing one more jolt of caffeine. To an outsider walking into Concourse C, nothing seemed unusual. Yet to those who had been there, the air still carried an echo, the kind of memory that lingers even when the world insists on returning to normal. Jack walked Ranger toward the gate at an easy pace. The shepherd's nails clicked softly against the tile, his harness steady beneath Jack's hand. Travelers still glanced their way, some openly, others shyly, their eyes filled with recognition. Phones had been tucked away for the moment, but he knew the story had already left the building, spreading into living rooms, offices, and coffee shops far beyond these walls. On the television above the gate counter, a news anchor spoke over replayed footage, the grainy clip of Vanessa's foot, the dog's stillness, the veteran's silence. Bold letters scrolled beneath, "Airport lockdown sparks national outrage." Jack looked away. He had lived long enough to know that the world thrives on spectacle, that people will watch a 30-second clip and believe they understand the whole of a man's life. But real truth was quieter, longer, written in years of showing up, not in flashes of virality. As he handed his boarding pass to the agent, a middle-aged man in a rumpled business suit leaned across the rope line. "Sir," he said quickly, almost awkwardly, My dad was in Vietnam too. Never talked about it much. But watching you tonight, I think I understand him a little better now. So, thank you. Jack paused only long enough to nod. He had no grand words, no sermon to give. Sometimes gratitude needed only to be received. On the jet bridge, the air cooled, humming with the sound of engines spooling up outside. Ranger walked close, unhurried. Jack felt the tension in his chest ease with each step. The storm was behind them now. Ahead was just another flight, another journey, another day. But the story did not end with him. Back in the terminal, the young boy who had called Ranger brave sat at the window with his mother, pressing his small hands against the glass as planes taxied by. I want to be like him when I grow up, the boy whispered. His mother kissed the crown of his head, murmuring, "Then, be steady, sweetheart. Be kind. That's how." At the same time, the teenage girl in the denim jacket, who had spoken about her brother's service dog, typed furiously into her phone, drafting a post not of outrage but of gratitude. Tonight I saw what dignity looks like. Not anger, not shouting, just quiet strength. We could all use more of that. Within minutes, her words were being shared as widely as the video itself. Even Vanessa Cole's name, when it surfaced in headlines the following day, could not eclipse the image of the veteran and his dog. For all her protests, all her denials, the story that the world carried forward was not about arrogance or entitlement. It was about restraint, about the weight of silence, about a dog who did not flinch and a man who did not need to shout to be heard. As the plane lifted off, the city shrinking below into a scatter of lights, Jack leaned his head back against the seat. Ranger rested his chin across his boots, eyes half closed, untroubled. Jack let the hum of the engines fill the silence between them. He thought of Millbrook, the quiet town waiting for him, of Eleanor and Maggie, of Lily with her restless fire. He thought of the faces in the terminal, of the boy, the mother, the businessman. He wondered if they would carry the lesson forward. That family, community, even the fabric of a nation, is held together not by loud declarations, but by the unseen steadiness of those who show up, who endure, who protect without demanding applause. Jack closed his eyes. For the first time that day, he allowed himself to rest. The world would keep talking, keep posting, keep arguing, but Ranger's steady breath was the only truth he needed. And in that quiet, high above the clouds, Jack Turner knew the lasting lesson was never really about airports or viral clips. It was about something far older, far simpler. The power of calm in the storm, the dignity of silence, and the truth that love, loyalty, and honor never need to raise their voices to be heard.